Dr. Komita. She is professor of tropical forest ecology in the Yale School of the Environment, and she has a secondary appointment in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. She is also co-director of the new Yale Center for Natural Carbon Capture, and she's a research associate at the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute in Panama. Dr. Komita earned a bachelor's degree in biology and a master's degree in conservation biology from the University of Pennsylvania, and she earned a PhD in plant biology from the University of Georgia. Her research focuses on the ecology and diversity of tropical tree species. Her current projects include studies on the role of pathogens in promoting tree species diversity, as well as on the role of drought events in shaping tropical forests. She was the recipient of the 2017 British Ecological Society Founders Prize and was selected as an Ecological Society of America Early Career Fellow in 2015. She also received a 2016 Yale Postdoctoral Mentoring Prize for her mentoring activities through the Women in Science program at Yale. Welcome, Liza. Thank you so much, Professor Komita. I like to call you all professors because it's fun and because it reminds me that we at the Academy are really doing the important work of bringing you, the professors at Yale, to our alumni community. So thank you so much for doing this presentation. I'll turn it over to you to get us started.
Great. Thank you, Lauren. Thanks for the introduction. And I'm definitely in professor mode today. I was just saying that I was updating my slides last night. There's so much new information out there, and I'm really excited to bring it to all of you. I've been watching the chat and seeing some familiar names there from the School of the Environment. I saw someone tuning in from Panama. Hopefully you recognize some of your beautiful forests and a number of the pictures that I use, since that's where I do a lot of my own research. I'm going to share my screen and get started. And hopefully everybody can see that. If not, someone let me know. But I'm really excited to talk to you today about how forests shape climate and also how climate change is shaping forests. And this is an extremely timely talk because I don't know if you've been paying attention this week, but right now we have the COP26, the UN Climate Change Conference going on in Glasgow, and these were the headlines coming out in the last day or two. These big pledges around deforestation, and you can see they're being met with some skepticism where we've seen such pledges before that haven't really panned out. Just a couple hours ago, Indonesia kind of pulled back on their deforest pledge, which was kind of disappointing. So we'll see how it pans out. But you might be wondering, well, this is a conference about climate change. Why are forests getting so much attention? And hopefully after you hear everything I tell you today, there'll be no doubt in your mind about why forests are getting all this attention in a climate change conference. So what I'm going to talk to you today about is how forests influence climate, how they regulate climate in different ways, and how, because of that, they can act to mitigate climate change, as well as intensify climate change, particularly through deforestation. And I'm also going to talk about how climate change has been and will continue to influence forests through increasing atmospheric CO2 concentration, increasing temperatures, and changes in rainfall and seasonality. So how do forests influence climate? You can see here it says, protect the forests, they are the climate umbrella of our planet. But what does that mean? Well, what everybody thinks about when you say forests and forests influence climate is carbon sequestration, right? We all know that photosynthesis is the process that pulls carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and it stores it in long-lived organisms. So specifically trees, as well as soil organic matter. And so forests and plants naturally are acting as carbon capture machines that are sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere for us and storing it. And if we look at the global distribution of photosynthesis, this is happening in the ocean as well, but also predominantly in forested areas around the globe. So forests are extremely important for carbon sequestration and drawing CO2 out of the atmosphere. But what a lot of people don't know is that forests do more than just store carbon. And there's a few different processes, biophysical processes, by which they affect climate beyond carbon storage. So the first is something called albedo. And that is the proportion of light reflected from a surface. And when you measure this, it's the comparison between the forest and what would be there otherwise, or what would have otherwise been there if you cut down the forest or plant a forest. And in this way, forests actually have a warming effect on climate. So if you think about it, if you go outside on a sunny day and you're wearing a black t-shirt, you feel that dark color absorbing the heat, absorbing the radiation, making you warmer, versus if you're wearing a light colored t-shirt, more of that is reflected and it's not warmed as much. Well, typically forests have a darker green color, and compared to what would be there if those trees weren't there, they are darker and they're absorbing more of that radiation. And so they actually have a warming effect from this process of albedo. But at the same time, there's another process going on, and that's called evapotranspiration. And you might recall this from biology classes way back when about the process of transpiration. So when a plant is photosynthesizing, it has these little pores on its leaves called stomata. And when they open to take in carbon dioxide, they also lose water vapor at the same time. And that actually has a cooling effect. It's evaporative cooling, which is when an area is cooled by the energy used in the evaporation process. And that's energy that would have otherwise heated the area's surface. And so by transpiring, by losing water through their stomates, they're having a cooling effect, as well as evaporation of water from the soil and from the surfaces of the plant. And this also cools the climate by creating cloud cover and precipitation. Finally, plants emit what's called volatile organic compounds. And depending on the location and the type of compound, these can have both warming and cooling effects. And this is definitely an area that needs more research. But in general, albedo and evapotranspiration, along with carbon storage, are the main processes by which forests influence climate. So what's the net effect of these processes on climate? So I've mentioned some of these are cooling and some of these are warming. So what's the outcome? And was a recent study in 2015 that got at that using global satellite data to analyze these biophysical effects of forests on climate. And what they found that was with lower albedo, forests absorb more shortwave radiation during daytime. So it's a warming effect. Like I said, walking outside on a sunny day in a black t-shirt. But they also showed that warming effect is offset, more than offset, by latent heat loss from this process of evapotranspiration, leading to an overall net cooling effect. But the net effect depends on latitude, it turns out. So albedo and evapotranspiration both vary with latitude. So in tropical forests, you have high cooling from evapotranspiration, and it completely offsets the warming from albedo, so that you have very strong cooling impacts of tropical forests. In temperate forests, you have cooling, evapotranspiration. Cooling is lower compared to tropical forests, and albedo warming is higher, but it still results in a moderate cooling net effect. In boreal forests, albedo warming completely surpasses the amount of cooling from evapotranspiration. And so actually boreal forests can have a warming effect on the climate. When we also go to look at carbon, we see that there are differences with latitude. And what we know is that tropical and subtropical forests store massive amounts of carbon, particularly above ground, compared to boreal and temperate forests and other ecosystems. So if we combine all three of these processes by which forests and trees influence climate, you see a general pattern, which is that tropical forests have the strongest cooling effect, stronger than temperate forests, which have a stronger cooling effect than boreal forests. So when we combine this cooling effect of carbon storage, the cooling effect of evaporative, of transpiration, and the warming effect of albedo, we see that tropical forests strongly cool the planet, more so than other forest types. So when we think about that, we can start to ask what happens when we cut down tropical forests. And this is just another map showing the density of carbon around the planet. And you can see really high carbon storage in the three major areas of tropical forests. So in Latin America, you have the Amazon basin. In Africa, the Congo basin, and in Southeast Asia, you have tropical forest across a large range of areas, including Indonesia and Malaysia and Thailand, Vietnam. But what we know is that we've been losing tropical forests, and that's resulting in high levels of CO2 emissions. So between 2000 and 2005, about 3 billion tons of CO2 a year came from gross deforestation in the tropics. And this is equivalent to emissions from about 600 million cars, twice as many as were in the whole US during that time. And currently, global CO2 emissions from tropical deforestation contributes to about 8 to 10% of total global CO2 emissions. And previous estimates were higher. I've seen estimates in the past around 15 to 17%. And this was decreased both due to improved methods, but mostly not because tropical deforestation has slowed, but because CO2 emissions from other sources have continued to rise sharply. So if tropical deforestation were a country, it would actually rank third in terms of CO2 emissions, behind only China and the US. So we're not talking about small amounts of CO2 emissions from tropical forest loss. We're talking about large amounts. And depressingly, what we've seen is those amounts have actually been higher in recent years. So this is some graphics from the World Resources Institute showing that emissions between 2015 and 2017 were 63% higher than the average from the prior 14 years. And so we're certainly not managing to significantly slow tropical deforestation, despite all these calls for reducing deforestation and policies that governments have attempted to put into place. So what's driving deforestation? Well, in the tropics, there's a number of commodities that account for the majority of deforestation. And the big three are beef, palm oil, and soybeans. And interestingly, this is not the soybeans that you're probably eating as tofu instead of beef. Most of the soybeans are going as feed for cows and other livestock. And then to a lesser extent, wood products. And if we look at the total forest replacement by these commodities between 2001 and 2015, we see that cattle is definitely the largest. You have large areas of tropical forest being cut down and converted to cattle pasture. And then oil palm and soy are also significant sources. And then you also see smaller amounts of deforestation from products like cacao, plantation rubber, coffee, and plantation wood from plantations. But these 7 commodities replaced almost 72 million hectares of forest from 2001 to 2015. And that's an area of land more than twice the size of Germany. And how these are playing out globally is very different. So cattle, for example, is the main driver of deforestation in Latin America. Particularly, you can see in this map here in the Brazilian Amazon and the southern Amazon, you see large amounts of deforestation being driven by cattle. Whereas in Southeast Asia, It's being driven really by oil palm. And this is something that's gotten a lot of news coverage, the cutting and burning of tropical forests and peatlands in Southeast Asia, and particularly Indonesia and Malaysia, and being replaced by these monoculture plantations of oil palm, which, you know, they look nice and green. They're technically trees, but the amount of carbon they store and the biodiversity they harbor is significantly, substantially lower than intact primary tropical forests that they're replacing. And then soy also is more dominant in Latin America and South America in particular. So if we look at patterns of deforestation over time, I showed you some recent data at the global scale showing that it was sort of flat, creeping up, and then has jumped a lot in the last several years. But this might lead you to think that it's not possible to stop deforestation. But Brazil, for a long time, deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon was a success story. So if you look at the curve in red there, from about in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, there was very high rates of deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon. And then due to policies, government policies that were implemented, deforestation decreased dramatically from about 2009 around till 2015. Unfortunately, it started to creep back up with some changes in policy in Brazil. And there's a sharp increase in deforestation in 2019. This leads me to another really important point about drivers of deforestation, which is forest fires. And so these 2019 spike in deforestation ended up resulting in widespread fires in many areas of the Amazon. And this is because the deforestation was often vegetation that was cut and burned to create cattle ranches and support land claims. Some of those fires were agricultural burns when fires are used in rotational agriculture from existing pastures. So they weren't resulting from new deforestation. But 2019 was particularly alarming because in this area, fires are often worse in drought years. But 2019, where we saw this big spike in Amazon forest fires, it wasn't a drought year in the Amazon. So this was particularly concerning. So why should we worry about fires in tropical forests? So in many ecosystems and in many forests, fire is a natural part of the ecosystem. It's a natural disturbance that occurs regularly. But this really is not the case in moist to wet tropical forests like the Amazon basin. And charcoal record points towards very infrequent fires in the Amazon, even during periods of pre-Columbian human settlement. And what this means is that the species growing in the Amazon, they are not adapted to fire. The tree species haven't evolved any of the adaptations to fire that are found in species, plant species you'd find in savannas or in, for example, ponderosa pine forests in the western US, ecosystems that have evolved with regular fire. So even low intensity fires can have a huge negative impact on moist to wet tropical forests. And this is a double whammy when we're talking about carbon. First of all, when that wood burns, it emits carbon into the atmosphere. It increases carbon emissions, but it also kills the trees that would sequester that carbon through photosynthesis. So it reduces future carbon sequestration because those trees are gone from the landscape. So why should we keep worrying if that's not worrying enough? Is that drier forests are going to most likely result in more fires. And under hotter, drier conditions predicted by climate change, where we expect to see drier forests, and at the same time we expect forests to become more open in many areas due to past fires, selective logging, fragmentation, which creates these edge effects where forests that occur near roads or near pastures at the edge tend to be drier and have lower humidity, and that promotes fire. And so what could happen is this cascading effect where we have Showed in this graphic here, you have beautiful tropical moist forest with tightly coupled hydrological cycle, water cycle, and deforestation then increases fire occurrence due to land use changes. And this leads to drier conditions, increased greenhouse gas emissions, and wildfire occurrence. And as a result, you have warmer, more arid scrub vegetation and a loss of biodiversity. So you can actually have an area shift from tropical moist forests to these fire-prone savanna ecosystems. And so to say this another way, all of these interactions between drought, fire, logging, and climate change could drive a large-scale replacement of Amazon forest by this fire-prone scrub vegetation, which stores much less carbon on the landscape and preserves much less biodiversity. And this is sometimes referred to as a tipping point and the Amazon dieback. You might have heard about this in the news. And the concern is if we continue with more droughts, more deforestation, more fires, that we will push the Amazon towards this state. So as we're thinking about climate change impacts on tropical forests, I want to go through and talk specifically about how forests are responding already and are likely to respond in the future to increase carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And this is both direct impacts of atmospheric CO2 as well as indirect effects from temperature and changes in precipitation. So it's now well established that human activity is leading to global climate change due to increasing atmospheric CO2 levels, as well as other greenhouse gases like methane and N2O. And so the current CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere are now over 410 parts per million, compared to pre-industrial levels of about 280. And this is the famous graph there with the red zigzag line going up of atmospheric CO2 concentrations recorded at the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii. And what we know is that this increase in atmospheric CO2 concentrations has resulted and is going to continue to result in temperature increases. And these will vary throughout the globe, but it's predicted to get warmer both in the tropics as well as outside, as well as even more so at the poles. And what gets less attention is how climate change is going to affect rainfall and precipitation. And in some areas, it's predicted to become wetter, actually, and in other areas, drier. And at the same time, climate change is predicted to increase the frequency of extreme weather events. So in this case, I'm showing a study that was a modeling study about extreme El Nino events and the fact that they're predicted to become more frequent due to global warming in the future. And what this means is different for different areas of the world. So you can see in this map here that the way El Nino plays out is if you're in the US, particularly out in California, you're used to El Nino meaning a wetter year. But throughout most of the tropics and Central and most of South America and Southeast Asia, it means drier conditions and severe droughts that can have large effects on forests. So if we think about increasing atmospheric CO2 emissions, what not everybody knows is that all of this extra CO2 we've been emitting, it hasn't all been going into the atmosphere. It's actually a good proportion of it has been taken up naturally by the ocean, what's called the ocean sink and the land sink. So oceans and the land, specifically vegetation, has been taking up some of the CO2, extra CO2 that humans have been emitting. And so both forests and the ocean have been buffering the CO2 emissions that we've been putting out there. And if you can see in the graph on the left, this global land sink, over the past 50 years, we've seen that the quantity of carbon absorbed by trees and other vegetations on land has been rising. So forests and vegetation on land have been taking up more and more CO2 over time. And so the question is, well, how is this happening? What is the mechanism? What's the underlying process? And I'll get to that in a minute, but I want to point out here, this was a really interesting study. It's about 10 years old now. But what I want to highlight is some of the numbers in here. So if you look at this table here, we can see first that intact and regrowing tropical forests in particular are taking up large amounts of CO2. So tropical forest regrowth is forest that was cut down and is growing back either naturally or through restoration efforts. Unfortunately, the amount of emissions coming from deforestation in the tropics is larger than the amount that's growing back, essentially. So the tropical land use change overall is negative in terms of its emitting carbon, contributing carbon to the atmosphere. But what's really interesting is what this box I have here in green, which shows the total sink in global established forests. Between 1990 and 2007, forests were taking up more and more carbon over time. So how is this happening? Why is this happening? And this is where it gets a bit technical, and you might think back to high school or intro biology. This is an effect called CO2 fertilization, carbon dioxide fertilization. And so photosynthetic rates of C3 plants. So C3 plants are trees, most plants you're familiar with, most trees you're familiar with. Grasses are often use a C4 system of photosynthesis, and things like cacti use another system called CAM, but most forest trees are C3 plants. And the photosynthetic rate of C3 plant leaves increases at elevated levels of CO2 in the atmosphere. And this is for a very specific reason. This is because when leaves open their stomates and take in air from the surrounding atmosphere, molecules of CO2 are able to compete more effectively with oxygen to bind to what's called rubisco, which is this enzyme involved in photosynthesis. So because plants need CO2 for photosynthesis, and this binding site, you have oxygen competing with CO2 to bind to this. When there's more CO2 in the air that comes in, it's more likely to bind to rubisco. And so it means that C3 plant photosynthetic rates often increase when you have elevated levels of CO2 in the atmosphere. And so this should contribute to plants growing faster and growing more efficiently. And we've seen increased carbon storage from long-term studies of tropical forests. So there are sites in South America and in Africa where people have been going in and measuring trees and looking at tree growth for decades. And what they've noticed over time is that the biomass in those forests has been increasing. And this supports this idea of CO2 fertilization, that actually having more CO2 in the atmosphere is good for plants. It's also beneficial for plants in another way. It allows them to become more water use efficient. And so this again gets back to the process of photosynthesis. And when plants open their stomates to take in air, they lose water vapor. So I mentioned that before when we talked about evaporative cooling. So when a plant opens its stomates, it loses water. But when there's more CO2 in the atmosphere, when there's higher CO2 concentrations, plants don't have to open their stomates as often. And so they're to get the same amount of CO2. And so they're losing less water. And this makes them, this ratio of water loss to carbon gain in this process is called water use efficiency. And so studies have also shown that there's these long-term increases in forest water use efficiency. What I'm showing you here is from a study in temperate and boreal forests in the Northern Hemisphere over the past 20 years. And it's suggesting that you have this strong CO2 fertilization effect that's benefiting plants and forests. They're becoming more efficient at using water. And more recent studies suggest that water use efficiency is increasing in forests worldwide. So actually higher levels of CO2 in the atmosphere are beneficial for plant growth. So this might make you feel really happy, like, great, forests can continue to be this carbon sink. We put out more CO2 and they love it. They grow faster, they take it up. So this increasing photosynthetic rate, higher water use efficiency will allow forests to mitigate our CO2 emissions. But unfortunately, that's not the whole story. So what we also know is that it's not just CO2 concentrations that matter for trees and tree growth. In many areas of the world, soil fertility is limiting, and studies have shown that soil fertility can limit carbon sequestration in forests in a CO2-enriched atmosphere. So in temperate forests, areas are typically, or forest plants are typically limited by nitrogen. In tropical areas, they're more limited by phosphorus. But in both cases, plants just can't keep growing faster and faster with more CO2 because they become limited by nutrient availability. As I mentioned before, we also know that higher atmospheric CO2 is changing our climate. So with more frequent droughts, we're more likely to see more mortality in trees. And this can shift forests from a carbon sink, to a carbon source. And one of the best examples of this, best studied examples of this, is droughts in 2005 and 2010 in the Amazon. So in 2005, the Amazon was hit by, at the time, what was called the worst in a century drought. And then unfortunately, only 5 years later, there was another more severe drought. And biologists working in the Amazon monitoring forest carbon saw a large loss of forest carbon during these droughts. And they had been seeing gains. So they had been seeing this CO2 fertilization effect where the trees were growing faster, the forests were increasing in biomass. But those droughts wiped out what was the equivalent of 9 years of those carbon gains. And so even though the forests were increasing in biomass, increasingly storing carbon, when these droughts came along, they took away that carbon that had been stored. And more recently, there was the 2015 El Nino event, which you might recall caused large droughts in many areas of the world, warmer conditions. And this study, using satellite observations, revealed unusually high levels of CO2 being released from 3 different tropical continents, tropical forest areas, during that El Nino event. But the reasons why were different in different places. So in South America, forest areas there experienced a long drought that slowed down plant growth. So those forests were taking up CO2 more slowly than usual. In Africa, higher temperatures increased rates of decomposition. So when plant matter decomposes, it releases CO2 back to the atmosphere. The CO2 that was sequestered through photosynthesis, stored in living tissue, then breaks down and returns to the atmosphere. And that process of decomposition is faster at higher temperatures. So that allowed more CO2 to escape from forest ecosystems in Africa during the El Nino. Whereas in Indonesia and Southeast Asia, the El Nino led to forest fires, forest and peat fires that burned through trees. And that released the carbon stored in those trees. And it also left fewer trees to pull that carbon back down in the future. So again, this is the double whammy of forest fires that I mentioned before. So in addition to drought, we can think about how increases in temperature might affect carbon storage. And so what studies have shown for a long time is that photosynthetic rates tend to increase with temperature. So that's what this graph is showing. This is for a single species and at 2 different levels of atmospheric CO2. So both 330 parts per million and then a highly elevated 100 parts per million. And as the temperatures warm, photosynthesis rates increase, which is a good thing, but they only increase up to a point. And when you get past that point, at hotter temperatures than the optimum, photosynthetic rates start to go down, meaning that plants are sequestering less carbon. Higher temperatures also increase decomposer activity, like I just mentioned in the last slide, as well as higher nighttime temperatures release or increase plant respiration, which is when plants release CO2. So those higher temperatures are not only slowing down photosynthesis and slowing down the amount of carbon being sequestered, but they're also increasing the amount of carbon that's being released back into the atmosphere through decomposition and respiration. And then in addition, increases in temperature can increase vapor pressure deficits. So lower humidity, essentially lower humidity can mean that plants lose more water. And so even though we've seen evidence that plants are becoming more water use efficient with higher CO2 concentrations, higher temperatures might cancel that out. So the current consensus suggests that increasing temperatures will reduce the ability of forests to sequester carbon. So to summarize that, I know that was a whirlwind of scientific background, so I just want to go back and summarize the main take-home points. The first is that forests influence climate not only through carbon storage. Carbon is what gets all the attention. People talk about forests as these massive carbon sinks, which they are, but they also influence climate through evapotranspiration, albedo effects, as well as emissions of volatile organic compounds. And so when we want to think about how to use forests for climate mitigation, how to restore, what the effects of restoring forests are or avoiding deforestation, we need to think about all of the different ways and take into account all of the different ways that forests influence climate. And importantly, compared to temperate and especially compared to boreal forests, tropical forests have a strong net cooling effect. This is both through their carbon storage as well as these other processes I've talked about, that tropical forests are the real winners when it comes to cooling the planet. We've also seen that increasing carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere have led forests to act as a carbon sink. Forests, maybe you didn't know it, but forests as well as the ocean have been doing us a big favor since the start of the Industrial Revolution and taking up a lot of the CO2 that we've been emitting so that it doesn't end up in the atmosphere, causing even worse effects on climate. But increasing temperatures and drought will reduce the carbon uptake by existing forests. And so we can't keep relying on existing forests to take up more and more CO2 well into the future unless we start cutting emissions and getting climate change under control. And a key part to doing that is reducing deforestation. As I've shown you, tropical deforestation, specifically in the tropics, causes about 8 to 10% of global CO2 emissions. And so that's obviously an area where we want to get that number down. But we also have the opportunity to increase forest cover by restoration efforts. And there's been a lot of momentum around restoration efforts and tree planting. And that's great. We need to make sure it's done well and done properly. And there's a lot of good work coming out about how best to do that. You need to be selecting the right species in the right landscapes, working with local communities, to making sure you're protecting the rights of local communities and indigenous groups. But reforestation offers an excellent way to help mitigate climate change as we work to cut emissions. And so one of the big take-home points that I've made is this focus in the tropics on avoided deforestation and increasing restoration to ensure that forests can continue to act as a carbon sink and help us mitigate climate change. I'd also like to point out that tropical forests harbor extremely high biodiversity. Biodiversity is actually my main area of interest and what a lot of my work focuses on in terms of understanding how you get such high levels of tree diversity in the tropics. But protecting tropical forests not only offers climate benefits, but also helps us address another crisis that we're currently experiencing, which is the biodiversity crisis, where we're losing huge numbers of species and seeing large declines in populations around the world. And so with that, I want to highlight a couple programs here at Yale, one older, one newer, that are addressing some of these issues. So I'm not sure how many of you have heard about the Environmental Leadership and Training Initiative, or ELTI. It's an amazing program that has been at Yale since 2006. It focuses on capacity development for conserving and restoring tropical forest landscapes. And its home is here in the School of the Environment, but they have offices in multiple countries around the world, including in Panama, Colombia, the Philippines, and elsewhere. And their mission is to develop the capacity of people who depend upon, manage, and govern tropical forest landscapes to restore ecosystem services and biodiversity using nature-based solutions that also support local livelihoods and local cultures. And they do this through a number of different means. One is field and online training courses. So they offer short courses where they take groups out to forest sites to get hands-on experience. And they also offer a number of online training courses in multiple languages for different groups. They have courses, in English, Spanish, Portuguese, French, and Indonesian at this point. Second, once someone takes one of these courses and they're an alum of the program, they then are able to apply for continued support from their leadership program, which helps them apply and share the knowledge that they acquired. And this aspect of the program helps generate long-lasting results in the landscapes where these people are working, as people experiment with more sustainable land management practices and share that with their neighbors. Excuse me. And finally, ELTI provides people with open access to a curated collection of resources about conservation and restoration in their tropical restoration library. So if you're ever looking for information about reforestation in the tropics, about particular species or particular topics, I highly suggest checking out their website. It is really amazing, all the resources that they've put together and made available. They now have over 8,300 passionate, results-driven alumni around the globe. They've taught 159 field courses, 41 online courses in 83 countries, excuse me, and supported 620 alumni who have completed the courses and then applied for continued support. And so if you would like more information, and I highly suggest checking it out, they have wonderful information on their website, which I've posted here, lt.yale.edu. And for those of you who would like more information, if I haven't completely saturated you about forests and climate and forest restoration, you might be interested. They now offer a year-long online official certificate program in tropical forest landscapes focused on conservation, restoration, and sustainable use. And the lecture I gave today, I give a condensed version of that as part of this program, and many other faculty at Yale, both from the ecological side as well as social scientists, provide content for this program that's very comprehensive. Excuse me. And finally, I wanted to talk a little bit about what is the latest news around climate change and natural climate solutions on campus at Yale. And this is the Yale Center for Natural Carbon Capture. And as Lauren mentioned, I am co-director of that center along with Dave Bercovici, who's a professor in the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences. And some of you may have seen some news articles about this. Earlier this year, Yale received a $100 million gift from the FedEx Corporation, and to start this Center for Natural Carbon Capture, which is focused on developing collaborative and innovative solutions to removing CO2 and other greenhouse gases from our atmosphere to help mitigate the effects of climate change. And the rationale behind this for FedEx, they rolled this out as part of their larger sustainability plan where they're electrifying vehicles on the ground, thinking about shipping materials and how to reduce emissions through shipping. But they also realized that a lot of their business relies on planes. And at this point, it's still challenging to rapidly reduce emissions from planes because it's hard to electrify planes. The market for sustainable airline fuels, sustainable aviation fuels is not fully developed. And so they were looking for other options to help offset some of their impact as they work towards reducing their emissions in every way possible. And so we were excited to have this gift and to explore research in different areas. And this is a research center. It's focused on what we're calling enhanced natural solutions. So as I mentioned before, forests are obviously one of the big areas that we're doing research in, but more broadly in areas of ecosystem capture. So in thinking about how we can enhance the ability of ecosystems, including agricultural systems, to take up carbon. And there's a focus on forest restoration in this ecosystem capture section of the center. But we're also looking at some other really interesting natural solutions. So one is geological sequestration, and it's something that I only started learning about in the last few years as we've been thinking about this center. And this is the idea that minerals actually sequester carbon from the atmosphere, and that there are ways, in particular through grinding up and spreading minerals, rock dust, to enhance how much CO2 is captured through geological sequestration and to speed that up both on land in agricultural systems as well as in the ocean. And so we have a number of researchers in the School of the Environment and the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences, which used to be the Geology Department, who are conducting research in this area to see how viable geological sequestration is as a climate solution. And then we also are reaching out to folks in chemistry, professors in chemistry and chemical engineering, to think about using nature as a model and designing industrial and engineering approaches to mitigating climate change. And so this new center, it just started about 5 months ago, and we've been making a lot of progress in terms of funding research projects by faculty here at Yale. We should be hiring new faculty with funding from this gift and really growing Yale's footprint in this area. And with that, I will stop and take questions about any or all of what I've just presented. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Komita. Wonderful presentation. Already lots of vibrant activity in the chat. I want to remind everyone that if you have questions, can you please post them in the Q&A box and not in the chat, because that helps me to keep track of all the questions and make sure that I've covered as many of them as I can. We have about a half an hour for Q&A, so should have plenty of time to get to all of your questions. I want to start with my own question, being a little selfish here, Professor Komita. How do biodiversity and carbon storage relate?
That's a great question. And that's something that you see a lot in the news as well. So the technical answer is that it depends on spatial scale. So at a global scale, we know that tropical forests store the most carbon, and they also harbor the most terrestrial biodiversity. And so biodiversity and carbon storage go hand in hand when we're talking about protecting, conserving, restoring tropical forests. When you zoom in on a landscape, they're not always so closely coupled. You might have areas that are dominated by a particular tree species that stores a lot of carbon. Typically, these are species that grow really large and have dense wood. And if they are dominant, that you can get very high carbon storage. But we also know at even smaller scales of, trees interacting with each other that biodiversity matters. So having higher biodiversity often results in more carbon storage and higher productivity, higher carbon sequestration. And the reason for this, there's a couple reasons. One is that if you have what's called niche partitioning, so if you have multiple different tree species, they each have slightly different resource requirements, and they can more fully exploit all the resources that are there. And so this allows those high diversity areas to be more productive. You see this, another reason has to do with disease and plant pathogens and herbivores, which is actually my first love and my what I would love to talk about with all of you at some point in the future is how plant pathogens and herbivores can have a positive effect on biodiversity. When you have a monoculture, and we know this from agriculture, when you have a stand of plants that are all the same species, they're typically all susceptible to the same pathogens and the same herbivores that spread very rapidly. And so this is a concept that's become very easy to explain, unfortunately, in the last year and a half with the global pandemic. But when you have a high density of susceptible individuals all crowded together, you get disease spreading very quickly. Whereas if you have a high diversity of trees all growing together, they're probably not, different species are not susceptible to all of the same diseases. And so that allows you to have lower mortality and higher growth rates in high diversity sites. And we know this also from agriculture. It's oftentimes when people notice that monocultures tend to grow more slowly than if you have mixed species plantations, for example, or are less susceptible to insect outbreaks or disease outbreaks.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. There's so much to talk about here. The questions are just piling in the Q&A box, and thank you for those of you who are posting questions. I want to invite Mr. James Rule. You posted a question in the Q&A box, but I invite you to post it in the chat so that everyone can read it, because only we can see it in the Q&A box. Someone asked a question which you talked about a little bit, and I wanted to draw it out. Let me see if I can find it. It's about the soil. Well, I'm going to go to Gary's question while I'm looking for this, because it's similar. Do tree organisms at their bases metabolize methane? Are there any species being genetically modified to metabolize methane, which is much worse for global warming than CO2? And he's also wondering if deforestation for cattle increases methane as well.
Yeah, methane is definitely something that we should all be talking about when we're talking about climate change mitigation. It's a powerful, potent greenhouse gas. The work on methane in forests is really fascinating, and it is definitely an area where we need a lot more research. So we know that there's actually methane emissions coming from forests, particularly from flooded forests. Now, if you cut those forests down and you put cattle pasture there and you put cattle there that emit methane, Would that be more than what was emitted by the forest? I don't know those numbers off the top of my head. I'm going to guess and say yes. We know that the overall climate impact is going to be higher from deforesting that area and then having cattle. But it also suggests, in terms of prioritizing areas for restoration, that maybe flooded forests, so large areas of the Amazon are seasonally flooded naturally, that maybe we should not prioritize those for restoration if we're bringing methane into the equation. But in terms of genetically engineering around methane, I'm not familiar with any current studies. That doesn't mean it's not being done, but I think that understanding this relationship between forest and methane is definitely an area where we need more research and where I'm seeing new studies coming out all the time.
Well, and we have one comment wondering about encouraging people to avoid beef in their diets, if that somehow can help contribute to solving the problem of deforestation for cattle pastures.
This is an argument my husband and I have all the time. So I don't eat beef, and he loves it, and so it's an issue that I know is a tricky one because people really love beef, but I think you need to be responsible about, if you are eating beef, where it's coming from, and I think that's true for kind of all products, that we have to think about as consumers the choices we make. Oil palm's another big one where it's a bit trickier to avoid. It's actually very difficult to avoid oil palm. I've stood in the soap aisle of the supermarket for 30 minutes reading the fine print of what's in everything to figure out if I'm buying soap with oil palm and if it's sustainable. And but I think the choices that we make as consumers are really important. And I've heard from folks that they are in companies that they are under pressure from consumers to have deforestation-free supply chains. And so I think, thinking about the choices you make is important. And so if you just can't give up your hamburger, I mean, I think the fake meat tastes just like real meat, but I haven't had real beef, a real hamburger in a few decades, and my husband says it's not the same. But so if you just can't bear to give up your occasional hamburger, there are other, excuse me, there are options out there where you can try and make sure that where you're getting your beef from is more sustainable. There's also options for making cattle branching more sustainable in general. So there's a practice called silvopasture, which is this idea of increasing tree cover in cattle pastures and on cattle farms more generally. And that's one area where LT works a lot actually with cattle farmers. I know in Panama on the Azuero Peninsula, a dry forest area that's largely deforested, they've been working with local farmers to increase tree cover on their farms. And that has a number of benefits, both for cattle production and milk production, but also protecting watersheds. So if you're making sure to protect forests around streams, you protect the watershed and water quality. And by planting trees, you're providing shade for cattle that could otherwise be overheated and have reduced growth or milk production with increasing temperatures. So I think there are ways to improve cattle pastures and cattle farming in the tropics to reduce their impact when it comes to climate change.
Well, and Leon has a follow-up to that, which is what is it more of a break-even ratio with regard to carbon when the areas that are cleared or deforested areas are used for agricultural crops rather than for cattle pasture, or is it just as equally problematic?
I think it depends on the specific crop. If it's something like an annual crop that's harvested each year, that stores very little carbon while it's growing, and then that carbon is taken off the land and consumed, rapidly, then I think it's probably no different from cattle pasture. If it's something like long-lived fruit trees, for example, where people are harvesting the fruit, but the tree is growing and the wood is staying there, then that would definitely have less of an impact. So I think it definitely depends on the crop and also how it's grown. So things like coffee and cacao can be grown under shade. So you see like shade grown coffee often. So there are ways to make some crops more climate friendly for sure.
Okay, Michelle wants to speak about soy and wondering how can we learn about the sources of the soy? You talked about most of the soy that's being grown is actually being grown for animal feed. But Michelle, I guess, is curious about, as a person who eats a lot of soy, making good informed decisions and how to go about getting that information.
That is a really good question. To my knowledge, I don't know of a certification program out there that exists for soy. If somebody does, please put it in the chat because I would love to know that. But I would say if you have switched from a meat-based diet to a soy-based diet, I would say that you've done most of the work already. Most of the soy that's being grown is being used for animal feed, and so and that's really where it becomes problematic. I think if you are eating a plant-based diet, that there are probably, I know we all want to do our best. Trust me, I know that feeling, but I think you also have to think about how to spend your energy, and maybe if it's not easy to figure out, I think eating a plant-based diet is an excellent step. And then instead of trying to figure out how to get the best soy, you could write a letter to your congressperson asking them to support climate change legislation or asking them to support efforts for forest conservation. So yeah, I know it's hard to think about how to reduce your impact, and sometimes the choices are easy. Other times, like me standing in the soap aisle trying to figure out what soap I can buy without feeling guilty, having just lectured to all of my students about oil palm driven deforestation in Southeast Asia. I know that it's can be hard, and it would be nice if it would be easier. And I think we're hopefully moving towards a world where companies know that they need to make it easier for consumers to buy products that are not linked to deforestation.
Well, and a lot of questions and people asking about what they can do. And so I think you've brought that point of one, being an informed consumer, and as well, being a proactive citizen with your state and local governments, pushing for legislation that supports climate change initiatives and supports the science that people like you and your colleagues are putting forth. I want to go to a couple of questions. People really concerned about the Amazon rainforest. You talked about the Brazilian Amazon, but we also know the Amazon is present in Peru and in Ecuador as well. So David asks, wasn't the Sahara Desert originally a tropical rainforest? And is this the future of the Amazon if we don't turn this situation around?
To my knowledge, the Sahara Desert was never a tropical rainforest, at least within the last tens of thousands of years. Tropical, if we go way back in time, we used to have tropical forests in Colorado, for example. So I'm not sure kind of on what time scale, but and you do see areas of desertification like around the edges of the Sahara where you're having increasing expanse of desert. I don't think we're going to see the Amazon become a desert. There's just too much rain there because of where it is located on the globe. But what we could see is a shift to a more fire-prone, scrubby savanna-like ecosystem that is very different from the closed canopy, humid, tall, tropical Amazon, iconic Amazonian forest that we have today. And I do think that is a real risk. And the more of the forest we lose, the more at risk the remaining forest becomes, because the forest loss actually it not only increases CO2 in the atmosphere, which leads to, warmer temperatures and more droughts, but it also on regional scales has a drying impact. And again, that can lead to more forest fires and just more opening up of the forest for further degradation. And so I think it is a real concern that you would see the Amazon potentially flip to a very different kind of ecosystem, which obviously would be not just a huge loss for biodiversity, but the climate impacts of that are something that none of us want to experience.
Well, I have to say the Sahara Desert comes up once in each of these sessions in someone's question. So I had to go to our daily Sahara question today. I want to go to Judith's question. How does oil extraction in the Amazon affect conservation and the ways that forests shape climates? I'm hearing more reports of intense heat and intense flooding in the upper Amazon basin.
That is a good question. So I know in many areas of the Amazon, especially in the Western Amazon, that there is active oil drilling. Mining is also a big threat to tropical forests in many areas of the world. I think when we're talking about taking oil out of the ground, fossil fuels out of the ground and burning it, that's leading to increased CO2 globally, and we're seeing those global impacts. I think that it's the fact that oil is coming from the Amazon doesn't really change that equation, but having oil and fossil fuel exploration in forested areas obviously does cause deforestation, as well as increases the potential for oil spills that can have really negative impacts on local biodiversity as well as local communities. And I've heard issues around, water quality and children being really sick from oil spills or from chemicals used in mining operations.
Okay, I want to go to Nilu's question. You mentioned that tropical forests harbor more carbon than boreal forests. What role does the soil and peatland in the boreal regions play in overall carbon storage? And how will destruction of these impact atmospheric carbon levels?
That's a great question. Yeah, anytime I start, saying how amazing tropical forests are, my colleagues that work in the boreal, like Oz Schmitz, who some of you probably know from your time here, he always says, well, no, there's all this carbon in the soil in the boreal. And it's true, there is a lot of carbon stored below ground in boreal forests and just in peat forests in general, which aren't restricted to the boreal. You have large areas of peat forest in Southeast Asia that I've heard recently that they found large areas in the Congo Basin as well, which is fascinating. And so protecting that below ground carbon is extremely important. You don't hear about it as much for restoration because that carbon takes a really long time to build up. And so that is concerning because if you destroy it, it is not easy to replace. In terms of the boreal, so I certainly would not advocate cutting down boreal forest or burning peat. I mean, that it has catastrophic effects. But the other concern really with the boreal and below ground carbon and peat is also as we have areas becoming warmer and drier conditions, that we're going to start losing some of that below ground carbon due to increasing temperatures or increasing droughts or forest fires. And that is it has the potential to emit large amounts of CO2 into the atmosphere. And so those systems, I certainly don't mean to imply that those systems shouldn't be protected, because they definitely should.
Okay, great. And there was another question on boreal forests, but I sort of feel like you've covered it. So I want to go to Stephanie's question on carbon capture by marine plants. There's clear geologic evidence that marine plants sequestered a lot of atmospheric CO2 during times of high concentration in the past. Does the increased CO2 and/or marine CO2 saturation impact the growth rates of marine plants?
So yes, this is a little bit outside of my area of expertise. I stay firmly on land, but so we have seen the ocean acting as a CO2 sink, some of which is being taken up by marine plants, and yeah. So I'm not going to go outside of my particular area of expertise, but the oceans are definitely a critical part of the equation, and they have served as a carbon sink, like forests, of taking up a substantial portion of the CO2 that we've emitted.
So with that, I'm going to go back into something that you spoke a lot about in your presentation. There are a number of questions about it. This idea that that plants can grow faster with more CO2 in the atmosphere, and that it grows rapidly. But then people are pointing to things that they've seen that show that at some point these trees and plants die off, even though they've grown rapidly from elevated carbon. And what exactly is the cause of that? You spoke about it in terms of the soil nutrients being relatively comparable to the growth of the plants, and whether or not they could actually achieve enough nutrients from the soil. But I just wonder if you could talk more about that, because there are about 3 or 4 questions of people wanting you to speak more on that phenomenon.
Sure. So, in theory, this elevated atmospheric concentrations of CO2 is good for trees. But that's not the only thing that's happening. And so it really depends on where you are in the world and what's happening there. In a lot of the US, you have invasive insect outbreaks or diseases that are coming through and having massive impacts on our forests in the US, and which is concerning. And in general, thinking about forest health and forest resilience is extremely important, because it's going to take more than just, in many areas, it's going to take more than just saying, okay, we're going to leave the forest untouched, because you do have these indirect human impacts on the forest from things like invasive insects. There's I think the spotter, I keep getting emails about spotter and lanternfly in this area. There's been, New Haven was the elm city. It's elm city, but we have almost no elms left because of the Dutch elm disease that took out most of the elms in the city. And in large areas of the West in the US, you have insect outbreaks coinciding with drought events as another one of these double whammies that are causing large scale mortality and increased CO2 emissions from tree mortality. So it's definitely not necessarily a great time to be a tree in most places. There are definitely some areas where it is, where having more CO2 to take in is a great thing, but you have to look at all of the other factors that are at play.
So Clark wants to know, given this point that you made that tropical deforestation exacerbates climate change, does the process work in reverse? If we reforest the tropics, will we get the sizable impact on the positive side of the scale?
Yes, we can reforestation offers the opportunity to draw down that CO2 and rebuild forests that would have those cooling effects as well through evapotranspiration and carbon storage. The problem is the process takes some time, right? Trees, especially, the trees that grow the fastest actually are the ones with tend to have lower wood density, meaning they actually are storing less wood. So it takes decades or longer to recover, and typically longer to recover the above ground carbon storage of forests. And so reforestation does offer an opportunity to draw down CO2 that's in the atmosphere. It cannot be a substitute for avoided deforestation, because if you're just cutting down forests and saying it's fine, we're just going to replant them over here, that is not a great plan, because first of all, we're running out of time to keep climate at the levels that we would like to, so prevent more than a 1.5 degree Celsius increase in temperature. And it's going to take forests decades to over a century to rebuild that same level of carbon storage. So reforestation is definitely a very powerful natural climate solution that can be used to draw down atmospheric CO2, but it has to go hand in hand with reducing deforestation, because that immediately puts that carbon into the atmosphere. I mean, in some cases, the wood could be used for long-lived products, so it doesn't go immediately into the atmosphere. But from what I know, most of the time, when you have deforestation, it's resulting in fairly short-term increases in CO2 emissions right after deforestation. And then not only that, but you've lost those trees that were growing there that were sequestering carbon. So again, it's this double whammy of putting more carbon into the atmosphere and taking away the organisms that help draw that back out.
Well, and reducing carbon emissions is another component that we've heard about from other speakers. So the presentation that you're giving is a really nice balance to that, to the messages that we've received so far. I want to just give Robert a chance, because he had a follow-up question on boreal forests. What about the tundra warming?
Yeah,
we just keep going further and further afield.
The tundra warming is like one of these, it's sort of up there with the Amazon dieback, where the more I think about it, it's something I try not to think about when I'm trying to sleep at night, where it's one of these processes that can just create this feedback cycle of, the warmer it gets, the more thawing you have, the more CO2 is being released, the warmer it gets, and you are locked into that cycle. In some cases, it's sort of interesting, because what we're also seeing is that you're having forests and other woody vegetation growing in places that were typically too cold before. And so you are getting some carbon sequestration benefits from that, from increasing forest cover into areas that are now warmer than they were. I am not up on the latest numbers when it comes to those ecosystems to know how that balances out. But there are some positives in terms of increased forest cover with warmer temperatures at higher latitudes. But I suspect, again, if it keeps getting warmer, that those benefits won't last for very long.
Okay. We're rounding out to getting close to the end of our presentation. So I wanted to make sure I give you a chance to make any closing remarks that you want to make. But before I do that, I want to give attention to Lisa's question, because it's something that I hear people often talk about, which is the neighbors who cut down the trees. Lisa says that her neighbor clear cut 2 lots, removing 10 to 12 trees that were over 80 years old, and wondering, how do small urban tree removals affect climate, if at all, locally or otherwise?
Yeah, urban trees are amazing. They really um, really do a lot of work for us. And I've seen some, I don't know the estimates off the top of my head. I've seen some studies about the cooling effects of urban trees, and how they substantially lower temperatures um, through shading and through these other more biophysical processes. Not so much the carbon storage, or to a lesser extent than large expanses of tropical forest, for example, but they definitely have strong cooling effects. And I mean, it's really easy to be upset about when you see your neighbors cutting down trees. And right now in New Haven, the power company just goes around and it hacks up these trees that are anywhere near the power lines, and people get I get pretty upset about that. So that's something I think we're working with local and state governments to think about the best ways to protect the ecosystem services provided by urban trees is really important. And thinking about how to increase tree cover in cities, but to do it in a really thoughtful way and meaningful way. And if you don't know about it, another amazing program from the School of the Environment at Yale is the Urban Resources Institute. And they plant trees for free all over New Haven. You call them, they come, they plant a tree for you. And it's a really amazing program around increasing urban tree cover. And I think that those kinds of programs are cropping up in other areas, but it might be something that you're interested in starting in your community. And I would say in particular, when it comes to urban trees, there's also definitely an environmental justice angle, where there's been studies that have shown that tree cover is much lower in lower income and minority neighborhoods. And there are substantial health and quality of life benefits associated with trees that are not, that go along with that. And so increasing tree cover in urban areas is really important, and thinking about how to do it well and to address some of these environmental justice issues is also really important.
Thank you so much. We just have just about a minute left, so I wanted to give you a chance to make any final comments that you would like to make, and certainly want to encourage people to check out the Environmental Leadership Training Initiative. And there were so many questions that we couldn't answer, some of them very technical, and so I encourage those of you who have that inclination to look into the certificate program at the initiative. And Professor Komita, any closing remarks from you?
No, just thank you so much. This was a great opportunity, and it's really, it gives me hope to see so many people so interested, and that people are paying attention, and that they're passionate. And I'm really hoping that the next couple of weeks at the COP meeting that we have some real progress, and hopefully we can work towards a world with lots of trees and not so hot temperatures.
Well, thank you. And this presentation has been recorded. It will be available on our website. Few people asking for your PowerPoint slides, so perhaps we can share those as well. And thank everyone for attending. We will see you at the next climate change conversation on November 8th. Bye-bye.